Thank you. Honourable Senators, pursuant to the order made yesterday, the Senate will proceed to consideration of Government Motion Number 17. Senator Gold.
Honourable Senators, I move the motion standing in my name.
Moved by the Honourable Senator Gold, seconded by the Honourable Senator Laboucan-Benson, that pursuant to Section 58 of the... May I dispense? On debate, Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honour. Honourable Senators, it's with a profound sense of responsibility that I rise today to speak to the motion before us. For the first time since it was passed in 1988, on Monday, February 14th, 2022, the Government of Canada invoked the Emergencies Act to proclaim the existence of a public order emergency in Canada. Last night, our elected colleagues in the other place approved the government's decision, thereby maintaining the additional authorities under the Act. I might add, because I believe it is material to the decision before us, that the other place's consent was given with the support of the New Democratic Party. As government representative in the Senate, it is my responsibility to explain to the Senate why the government has to seek the Senate's confirmation so that the Act can continue to apply in the coming days under our supervision. I do so with humility, but I also do so with the firm conviction, confirmed by the events of the past 7 days, that the government had reasonable grounds to invoke the Act. As we begin our debate, I would like to start by thanking the law enforcement professionals who have been working day and night to bring peace back to the streets of Ottawa and to thwart emerging plans for new blockades, ensuring that blockades of critical infrastructure stop metastasizing across our country. And as we stand on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, I also want to pay tribute to all who call Ottawa home, citizens who have been besieged for weeks by folks who have not respected the rule of law or the democratic institutions that our national capital represent. As senators, the people of Ottawa host us every week. They lodge us in hotels around the Hill. They feed us in restaurants, at the Senate cafeteria, or even the Rideau Centre. They staff our offices. They do the hard work of ensuring that our democratic institutions can always function, even in a pandemic, even in a blockade. They keep us safe. And no one should fear coming to work in this place. People of Ottawa deserve their freedom, freedom to live their lives, free from assault, free from fear, free from harassment, free from crime, free from chaos. I know that the citizens of Ottawa have our backs. With extraordinary measures having been in place for little over 1 week, we in the Senate are now called upon to concur with our elected colleagues and accept the government's initial decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Should we do so, we will then bear the weighty responsibility, together with our House colleagues, to act as a check, to monitor, to supervise, and to adjudicate the uses of the Act. As parliamentarians, we are now called upon to determine whether the government has satisfied the terms of the Act, such that the measures taken pursuant to it may remain in effect until they are no longer required. Today, however, we have the benefit, the luxury, the benefit of hindsight. We take our decisions during an unprecedented and multifaceted law enforcement operation in which the tools created under the Act are being used effectively to bring this emergency to a successful end as quickly but as peaceably as possible. As we have seen, the impact of the Act has been pivotal. We know it is making the difference because those implementing the operation are telling us so and are asking us to keep it in place so that we do not squander the progress that has been made. In many ways, we are deciding whether our government and our law enforcement agencies across Canada can continue to use the tools that, so far at least, have turned the tide and shifted momentum back into the camp of law and order. Now we decide whether we allow these measures to continue so that Canadians can effectively put this chapter behind us and begin a process of healing. Honorable Senator.
Honourable Senators, the government has declared a state of emergency. Once the declaration is made, special temporary measures can be implemented to respond to the emergency. Any measures taken under the Act must be exercised in accordance with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and must be carefully tailored to limit any impact on Charter rights to what is reasonable and proportionate in the circumstances. In order to support senators and ensure that they are well informed, our office organized 2 technical briefings, made ministers available to answer senators' questions, and circulated and tabled all documents required under Section 58 of the Emergency Measures Act. It is essential that the Act also provide for rigorous parliamentary oversight and review at every stage of the process, a matter to which I will return later.
We outline the temporary measures that have been put in place to date, both under the Emergencies Act and the regulations promulgated thereunder. These measures were carefully chosen and designed to respond to the situation, to fill gaps in provincial and local authorities and capacity. I would summarize these measures as follows. Measures to temporarily regulate and prohibit public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. Measures to temporarily designate and secure places where blockades are to be prohibited. This could include borders, approaches to borders, other critical infrastructure, the parliamentary precinct in Ottawa, or other places where there is evidence of an imminent unlawful assembly. Measures to temporarily authorize or direct any person to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's public and economic safety, and for those persons to be fairly compensated for that work. Colleagues, this has made it possible to remove many of the large trucks that have blocked access to the parliamentary precinct and have imposed unacceptable hardships on the residents in the area. Measures to temporarily limit financial support for unlawful assemblies, notably through the temporary cessation of service from financial institutions and the application of reporting requirements to crowdfunding platforms. Measures to temporarily enable the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required, and the imposition of fines or imprisonment for contravention of certain orders or regulations made under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. All these measures have been used effectively and in a responsible and respectful manner, as we have seen and are seeing in Ottawa. Let me turn now to the provisions of the Act setting out the criteria for invoking a public order emergency. The government is firmly of the view that it has met the legal threshold outlined in the Act. To lawfully invoke the Act, the legislation requires that the government have reasonable grounds that a public order emergency exists. Based on all the facts and evidence at its disposal, the government believes that it has such reasonable grounds, and that is why the Act has been invoked. Allow me to outline for the Chamber the relevant provisions of the Act, which, as you will see, point to a highly fact-driven analysis. And I will subsequently elaborate on the facts, contexts, and circumstances that can be disclosed that have led the government to the conclusion that the Act had to be invoked. Section 17 of the Act is the most crucial. It provides as follows, and I'm quoting, "When the Governor and Council believes on reasonable grounds that a public order emergency exists and necessitates the taking of special temporary measures for dealing with the emergency, the Governor and Council, after such consultation as is required by Section 25, may by proclamation so declare." The criteria defining what constitutes a public order emergency under the Act are highly contextual. Section 16 of the Act defines a public order emergency as, and I quote, "an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada and that is so serious as to be a national emergency." Close quote. The Act therefore requires the government to have a belief rooted in reasonable grounds that there exists an emergency arising from, again I quote from the Act, "threats to the security of Canada," and that it considers, again on the basis of reasonable grounds, that those threats amount to a, quote, "national emergency." Now, the concept of threats to the security of Canada is defined in Section 2 of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act, and it includes the following activities under Section 2B. Foreign influenced activities within or relating to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person. Section 2C. Activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purposes of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state. And Section 2D, activities directed towards undermining by covert, unlawful acts, or directed towards or intended ultimately to lead to the destruction or overthrow by violence of the constitutionally established system of government in Canada. Meanwhile, the concept of national emergency is defined in the Emergencies Act as, and I quote, an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that A, seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians, and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial of Canada, and that cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. Based on all the facts at its disposal, the government has reasonable grounds to believe that over the course of the past few weeks, the threats posed by the convoy movement has amounted to this. I would underscore in passing that some provinces requested assistance or explicitly expressed that the situation went beyond their capacity to deal with it, including Ontario and Alberta. In fact, over the course of the past weeks, a range of local authorities, from municipalities to police chiefs to provincial premiers, stated that they did not have sufficient capacity to act at various points in time. In invoking the Emergencies Act, the federal government is responding to the assessments of those levels of authority. I, for one, would be astounded, if not indeed flummoxed, if a court ever deemed that, despite all of the public statements and requests for assistance we have seen, that the local authorities had the capacity to deal with the situation in an effective manner. I would also note that while one may argue that the situation could have been dealt with with other laws, one would be hard-pressed to make the case that the situation could have been dealt with effectively, which is what the Act talks about. Here, the benefit of hindsight is very helpful. We now have seen how ineffectively the situation was managed without the Emergencies Act, and how effectively the situation has improved since it has been invoked a week ago. We also have every reason to believe that the Emergencies Act remains necessary for Canada to be able to respond to ongoing threats to re-establish blockades of critical infrastructure or border crossings. Law enforcement agencies are currently relying on the Act to set up secured areas in downtown Ottawa and at border crossings, preventing foreign money from continuing to fund illegal blockades and ensuring that our borders remain open. Yes, the Windsor Bridge and the Coutts border crossing were eventually cleared, but at what cost? And as the discovery of weapons and body armor reveals, at what risk to law enforcement and the public? And indeed, the Emergencies Act has played a crucial role in ensuring that the situation is brought under control, avoiding a renewed spread of blockades by occupiers and their sponsors looking for a new target. I will now endeavor to provide senators with further context and factors that have led the government to conclude that there are sufficiently reasonable grounds to believe there is a public order emergency, that is, an emergency arising from threats to the security of Canada that is so serious as to be a national emergency. I would note that this is a highly factual and contextual question which necessarily relies upon information that may not be shared in the context of our debates. And in that regard, I think the government is owed a certain degree of deference vis-a-vis the security assessment it has made. I would also note that the position of the government is elaborated in one of the documents tabled in the Senate Monday and shared with all senators last week, entitled February 14, 2022 Declaration of Public Order Emergency, Explanation Pursuant to Section 58(1) of the Emergencies Act. As the document states, and I quote, "The Freedom Convoy 2022 was the first manifestation of this growing movement centered on anti-government sentiments related to the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Trucker convoys began their journey from various points in the country, and the movement arrived in Ottawa on Friday, January 28, 2022. Since then, the movement has only continued to gain momentum across the country, with significant increase in numbers in Ottawa, as well as protests and blockages spreading to different locations, including strategic points of entry, example, Ambassador Bridge, Ontario, Coutts, Alberta, and Emerson, Manitoba. And later on, the document continues, and I quote, "The movement has moved beyond a peaceful protest, and there is significant evidence that illegal activity is underway," close quote. Colleagues, the ongoing occupation of downtown Ottawa by the so-called Freedom Convoy held the city and its residents hostage for 3 weeks. Far from being peaceful, they caused considerable harm to the city and its residents. There was evidence of destructive, racist, and violent behavior. Small businesses endured illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods and harassment of their patrons and staff. The convoy's rhetoric was toxic, dangerous, and at times hateful. Swastikas, Confederate flags, and other odious symbols of anti-Semitism and white supremacy are disgraceful and unacceptable, yet they also played a role. The calls to topple our democratically elected government and its institutions by relying upon a show of force in our nation's capital were evident and encouraged by the extremist entities. There were incidents of threats, an attempt to set fire to an apartment building, and the need for police protection for a brave young woman who sought and won an injunction against constant noise in the downtown core. Moreover, across the country, the blockades we saw at borders in multiple provinces harmed our economy and endangered public safety. For example, near Morden, Manitoba, because of a convoy blocking traffic, it took over an hour for a woman in her 80s suffering from chest pains to get to the hospital. After the federal government announced its intention to invoke the Emergencies Act, and in the days since, many of the United States, the breakdowns in the distribution and availability of essential goods, services, and resources to Canadians. These demonstrations have raised the levels of unrest and violence in our country to unacceptable levels, threatening our safety and security. Indeed, there is clear evidence that some participants in these activities are prepared to use violent means to achieve their goals. We have heard reports of threats of force to oppose removal of the blockades. The recent seizure by the RCMP of a cache of firearms with a large quantity of ammunition in Coutts, Alberta, and evidence that some protesters are alleged to have conspired with RCMP officers are troubling examples of this fact. Demonstrators across the country, emboldened by the blockades and the occupation of our nation's capital, have made clear that their objective is to force the government to remove all COVID-related measures or to overthrow our democratically elected government, potentially by force. Colleagues, what began as a protest against vaccine mandates for truckers at the border morphed into a joining of forces of all those opposing the mandates, truly, really all public health measures by all levels of government, and those wanting to destabilize the government through outside foreign influence, and those angry about the results of the last election and who are determined to overturn it. The Memorandum of Understanding put forward by Canada Unity called for our duly elected government to be replaced. And I quote from the Memorandum of Understanding. In this case, it reads, "The parties are the people of Canada, the Senate of Canada, and the Governor-General of Canada, the highest authorities representing the federal government. The matter to be discussed and agreed upon is this: the Senate of Canada and the Governor-General, combined, referred to as the federal government, are to uphold and enforce all Canadian and international human rights laws that are clearly laid out in the MOU, or resign their lawful positions of authority immediately." Close quote. The founders of Canada Unity are the same people who have also called for charges of treason to be leveled against the Prime Minister, and they are some of the first organizers of the convoy to Ottawa. Another organizer and folk hero of the convoy has stated publicly that COVID-19 is a man-made bioweapon and warned of a, quote, endgame to depopulate the Anglo-Saxon race, close quote. In December, while talking of public health measures on his live stream, he said, and I quote, "The only way this is going to be solved is with bullets," close quote. In its 2020 report, CSIS states the following, quote, Some violent extremists view COVID-19 as a real but welcome crisis that could hasten the collapse of Western society, close quote. CSIS is so concerned about these groups that it has elevated ideological violent extremism to the highest threat to Canada, ahead of religious extremism and groups like Al-Qaeda. The crowdfunding site Give, Send, Go was hacked, and a list of donors was made public. Of those who donated to the illegal protest in Ottawa, there are reports that more than 300 donations came from the Oath Keepers, the group that participated in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. In Coutts, Alberta, along with the seized firearms and ammunition, there was body armor with the insignia of a group called Diagolon. According to Candice Kelschel, an expert from the Justice Institute of British Columbia, Diagolon's purpose is to, and I quote, incite a race war. This weekend, there were reports that members of Diagolon posted on social media the names of police officers who have been helping give the residents their city back. And let's remember that the charges laid in Coutts include conspiracy to murder police officers. These are but a few examples of the threats that Canada faces, not only in Ottawa, but wherever a regrouping may be planned via social media. Honourable Senators, even if the initial intent of the convoy was to come to Canada and express displeasure about border vaccine mandates, these efforts were co-opted by extremist elements who used good faith protesters as a Trojan horse to advance their nefarious intentions. It is a matter of public record that there have been threats of serious violence against persons or property, including critical infrastructure, for the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective within Canada. This alone satisfies the definition of a threat to the security of Canada, which is a key element of a public order emergency as defined by Section 16 of the Act. The other element is that this threat to our security must rise to the level of a national emergency as defined in Section 3 of the Act. As I've already outlined, it is clear that the convoys and blockades pose a serious danger to Canadians. And as become evident over 3 long weeks, as blockades became entrenched and started spreading across the country, provincial and municipal law enforcement were unable to effectively enforce the law in their jurisdictions within a reasonable time frame. For example, despite invoking provincial emergency measures, Ontario did not have the ability to compel service from towing companies, which was one of the main challenges both in Ottawa and on the Ambassador Bridge. In Windsor, tow trucks from Michigan came north to help out. But that's not an option elsewhere or everywhere. Under the Emergencies Act, the federal government enacted measures to overcome this challenge. Also, no province or territory acting alone could effectively cut off financial support for the blockades. Some provincial service providers are provincially regulated, but each province can only regulate its own, and banks are federally regulated. Under the Emergencies Act, the federal government has been able to target the funding that was paying for the food and the fuel sustaining the blockades. But that is not all. As outlined in the document tabled yesterday, the blockades and protests threaten the security of Canada's borders, with the potential to endanger the ability of Canada to manage the flow of goods and people across the border and the safety of CBSA officers, and to undermine the trust and coordination between CBSA officials and their American partners. Additional blockades are anticipated. This has been a national crisis beyond the capacity of any single province or territory to address. And while after this weekend we hope we're turning a corner, we are by no means out of the woods. For this reason, the federal government has stepped in and used the legal tools at its disposal to address this unique situation. This unprecedented step of invoking the Emergencies Act is being taken in response to an unprecedented state of affairs. These measures are necessary to bring an end to the illegal activities and blockades and to deter their repetition. As stated by our colleague Senator Vern White and former Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay in their joint article for the National Post, from which I quote, "What we have seen in the occupation of Ottawa and blockages at border crossings is not the right of protest enshrined in our Constitution, but illegal activity that represents a national security and economic threat to Canada," close quote. Law enforcement professionals, from Senator White to the Canadian Police Association and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, have been clear in recent days that the emergency orders have been a key factor in the progress we've seen in Ottawa. And Michael Kempa, Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, has made clear that, and I quote, "Once the protests took possession of downtown space, once rights for others were infringed by the illegal protests and illegal protesters, once it expanded to include border crossings affecting the economy, it became a national emergency when it threatened the stability of the economy and rights of others. Municipal, provincial governments did not have the power or the resources," close quote. Chers collègues,
Dear colleagues, the government took the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act seriously. This decision was made following a careful assessment of the situation across the country. Ongoing engagement with public servants and law enforcement across the country, and extensive discussions during 3 meetings of the Cabinet Incident Response Group on February 10th, 12th, and 13th, 2022. Prior to invoking the Act, the government also consulted with the provincial and territorial premiers as required under Section 25 of the Emergencies Act. Several premiers, including Premier Doug Ford, expressed their inability to manage blockades and occupations and called on the government to act and support the decision. Other premiers felt they had the tools to manage the situation in their province. A report of these consultations, as well as a summary of commitments between the government and other provincial and municipal officials, was tabled in the Senate on Monday and distributed to all senators last week. The invocation of the Emergency Measures Act was deemed necessary to provide additional tools to law enforcement and other institutions to respond to the emergency. And they are still needed, even though the situation in Ottawa seems to have greatly improved.
As interim Ottawa Police Chief Steve Bell stated during his news conference of February 18th, and I quote, "The 3 levels of government have come together to support our efforts in this, have led us to be able to have the success we're starting to see right now. The Emergency Measures Act, the Provincial Emergency Act, as well as the City of Ottawa emergency and injunction that have been provided, have created the ability for us to use powers and use new and existing powers to be able to properly deal with the demonstration to ultimately bring it to an end. Without the authorities that have been provided to us through these pieces of legislation, we wouldn't be able to do the work we are doing today," close quote. Colleagues, the blockades and assemblies are not isolated incidents, nor are they spontaneous. There's evidence of coordination between the various convoys and blockades. There's also evidence of significant funding and other support being provided by those connected to far-right extremist groups, both in Canada and elsewhere. The measures authorized under the Emergencies Act are required to stabilize the situation and to ensure that further illegal activities and blockades do not continue. Let me turn to several issues and questions that have been raised about the Act and the measures that have been authorized by it. The first concerns the application of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter applies to the Emergencies Act and to all actions taken pursuant to the Act. There is no temporary suspension of rights or freedoms as there was under the Old War Measures Act. Furthermore, all acts must be consistent with our international human rights obligations. But don't take it from me. Take it from Ed Broadbent, the former leader of the New Democrats. Compared to the War Measures Act,